Okay, so for this assignment, you are essentially doing a portrait of two pears. So you're going to set up your pears with a single light source. I've used a clamp light here. If you don't have a clamp light, you could use a desk light, something with a bendable arm, perhaps a very large flashlight if you have the sort that they use in like for camping or something like that. But you need to be able to create a clear light mass and shadow mass and cast shadow on your pears. And I recommend that you have the pears seated on one value with a contrasting value behind them. So I've put a piece of white paper underneath my pears and a piece of black cardboard behind them. You could also cut out the side of a box and put a piece of white paper down and just use the contrast of the box behind them, and that will also help you to control the ambient light in the room to get a clearer light and shadow mass on your pears. So take some time to set up your pears and then think about the relationship between the pears. So consider them as not just pieces of fruit, but as sitting in or representing two figures. Are they having a conversation? Do they have their backs turned on each other? What is the relationship, the conversation, the narrative between the two pears? So mine are sort of leaning towards each other. If you imagine the stems on the pears as faces, they're also turned towards each other in sort of an intimate gesture. So consider that as well when you are setting up your pears. Now this assignment is one that I want you to really spend some time completing to the highest level. You are doing this assignment not just to study pears, but because the value that you will render on the form of the pears is going to lend itself very well to drawing the value on a figure. Think about the rounded forms of the muscles on the figure, of the shapes on the figure. And so this is really going to help you with the rendering of value on your figure drawing. And also, I want you to get better familiar with using your tools, your charcoal pencils as a drawing medium. And for my class, I want you to render all value transitions with your pencils, no smudging or smearing. You will have plenty of classes in the future where the instructors will allow you to get out those blending stumps and get in there and blend away. I want you to learn how to carefully control your rendering with your sharpened charcoal pencils. First thing, I have my toned paper. You have created your 9-step value scale as a reference. Consider where your eye level is going to be. So I'm going to say about in here. And you are going to create a light gesture of your pears. Think of the axis. So I have one kind of leaning this way, another leaning this way, and I'm already seeing, I think I want them to be up a little higher. So the nice thing about toned paper is you can just use that dirty tissue or paper towel and make adjustments. Okay, and I want you to create your pears as life-size as possible, or a little larger. Now, I'm starting with just a gestural sketch. They look pretty close. in size. I always do the stems last. All right, then you want to do some comparative measuring and look at, I'm going to start with my left pear. How tall is that left pear compared to how wide it is? So if it's this tall, according to my gestural sketch, looking at its widest part, I've got it just about right. So let's see, that would be like 3/4 wide compared to its height. Now the pear next to it, I'm going to look at the height on this one where it reaches across. And it is, there is a gap, but maybe a little smaller. I'm going to make this one a little bit taller here. And look at how tall the height of my second pear in relation to how wide it is. So highest point to where it's sitting at the table. And that one's about right too. So more so, I want to now look a little closer at the outer shape of the pear. Really look at those angles. How much of the pear is actually touching the surface of the paper that it's sitting on? Where does it angle back up? And I'll do the same here. So the tops of the pears are not usually straight. They tend to have a little angle on them. Look at the negative shapes between the pears. How much of them touches. And also look to see where that point that they sit on the surface lines up with the highest point of the pear. So that one's feeling pretty good. It's hitting about there. You can also check the angle of the highest point to the lowest point. And that's looking pretty good. On my other one here, lowest point meets up right about there. A little more of a slope here. Okay, that's pretty good for my overall shape of the pears. I'll get those stems in now. This pear has a much taller stem and it's leaning up this way. this one, the stem comes across and about maybe that high compared to the other one. It's foreshortened because it's leaning towards me. So I'm going to make mine like that. So once you have the outline of your pears, you need to map out your shadow shapes. So squint your eyes and look closely at the overall light mass versus shadow mass. So right now, ignore all the transition values and try to get, as carefully as you can, map out where the light is hitting the light source and that general shape that the shadow mass is making on the other side of the pear. And I'm going to map out a few of the shadow shapes that are more like little dimples running through my light mass, just carefully here. And then in my larger shadow shape, there is a reflective light that runs around this side. So I'm mapping that out too. So squint your eyes to help you really see the light versus shadow. And get those shadow masses in there. The closest you can get your light to the pears, the greater contrast, the easier it's going to be for you to really see the light versus shadow on them. And map out your cast shadows, carefully looking to see what direction they're going, what shape they're taking on. And I have one that is kind of melting into the other one. So there's kind of a double cast shadow there. And I need to lower that horizon line a little bit. Okay, and on my stems, map out all your shadow shapes, light mass, shadow mass. And if you have cast shadows bouncing up onto the back wall, be sure to include those. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is really look at my value structure here and squinting. The first thing I'm going to ask myself is, where are my lightest lights? Those reflective lights, the ones that will be that number one on your value scale. And I am going to carefully, while squinting my eyes up here, go, okay, I have a highlight, lightest light that is right in here. And I'm just going to map out that lightest light area with using my kneady eraser and constantly reshaping it, almost like a drawing tool, only instead of adding value, I'm subtracting it. So I'm getting a highlight right there and also right up here at the top. There's a little ledge here. So I'm going to put that in. And then on my other pear that's facing the light source, right in here, there is a reflective light. So I'm going to map that out. And then on the surface that they are sitting on, this is very light, but I'm not going to erase out the entire surface because the light is hitting closer to this side, so the paper is lighter on my left than it is on my right, and I will have to make adjustments for that. So right now, I'm just going to erase out this far side. Now you are going to spend, I would say, probably 2 hours on this assignment. I am not, or it would mean you sitting here forever watching me. And I don't think my phone is going to last that long. So right now, I'm just carefully lifting out those number 1 lightest lights, and I'm only going to go about that far for right now. And then the next thing I'm going to do is ask myself, where are my darkest darks, those number 9s, and using my extra soft charcoal pencil, I'm going to put those in. So I'd say right here, there's a little area where my 2 pears meet. And then on my stems, right in here, and up at the top part, but not all the way down. It starts to get a little bit lighter. And on my other stem, right in here, that's pretty good. And then right where they are sitting at the table, I'm going to push in a little of that dark on either side. Remember, that's called your pit or your occlusion shadow, where the value is darkest under the object where your light cannot reach. Now that I have found the darkest dark and the lightest light, I want you to consider where your number 5 areas are. Now, that number 5 is the tone of your paper, that middle gray. Your number 5 is often going to act as a little transition area between light mass and shadow mass. You should never have the eraser coming right up next to your charcoal pencil. Kind of keep those separated. So you can either work all your shadows and then all your lights, or kind of back and forth. I tend to like to do both and work them kind of simultaneously so I can see their relationship to each other. So squinting and looking at my number 1 pear here, I'm going to start by carefully removing more of my light mass, that area facing the light source. But you have to be careful because you can't erase out anything to be lighter than your number 1. Only those areas can be your number 1. The rest then have to be 2s, 3s, and 4s. So I've created a point with my needy eraser, and I'm going to start carefully removing my light mass. And consider the form of your pear. Squint a lot. Really look to see where those values shift. what areas might be number 2s, what areas are going to be number 3, and really squint up there. This area around my highlight is where the light's hitting the strongest, so I'll expect that to be closer to a number 2. Kind of going around that highlight. And then that light will drop off as it moves away from your light source. And because the pears have some bumpy surfaces, there might be areas that are catching more of the light, and then some that aren't catching quite so much. So really think about the contour. Then I have mapped out a couple places of shadow where there were dimples in that light mass area. But I'm starting to get a little closer to my shadow mass that I mapped out. So I need to make sure I leave some of that number 5 transition area in there. And I'll slowly keep building up these lights. I think I can pull out my highlight even more there. And I'll keep squinting. Now, one rule is you want to make sure that you don't have any lights in your light mass, or any darks in your light mass that are facing that light source that are as dark as anything in your cast shadows. So make sure you're not using your charcoal pencils in that light mass area, that you're just really using your eraser to control those lights. And I'm going to pull out some lights up here on my stem where it's facing the light source. And now I'm going to use my medium pencil to start controlling some of those shadows in here. Now you're looking to see where do those shadows get darker than your number 5 transition area. And compare them to your background. I want to clean up that edge there. I can just rub that back in with my paper towel. So my shadow gets a little darker right along this side here. Now I'm using my mark making, all going the same direction and close together to let that value kind of feather out. Now it gets a little darker right where the two are coming together. So I'm going to push that a little further. And there's that terminator, that area, that little ribbon of darkness. And I put that little smudge too high. I think maybe my finger put down there a little by accident. Terminator is that part of your cast shadow that is where the or not cast shadow, but form shadow, where the object is turned away from your light source. It's just past the that transition area where it starts to feel like there's a little ribbon of darkness that's a little darker than the inside of your form shadow. So I'm pushing that terminator in here. I'm considering the shadow shapes on my pear. It's a little lighter down in here where the paper is reflecting up into it, but you never want to make those reflective lights any lighter than your number 5, because if you make them lighter, it's going to flatten out your object. So even if your eyes say, no, I see a really bright reflective light there, you're not going to draw that reflective light. So following the form of your pear, keep adjusting those values and squinting. So I'm going to darken that a little bit. Darken up in here a little bit. I'm going to let there be more information in the side that is facing the light, because when you squint, all those values tend to smooth out the lumps and bumps. So it's really more about the general shadows in there. And look how I'm carefully building up those values and adjusting them. And shading, controlled shading with my pencil, all the marks going the same direction. Now, I don't want to keep this line where I mapped out my shadow shapes, so I'm going to carefully lift that out. And I can just use a little bit of my paper towel to rub that back, and then I will adjust my shadow shape here. All right, there's a little shadow shape right in here where it turns away from the light source. So this is actually a little shadow mask, little tiny one in here, but I will not let that get too dark because it's too close to my light mask side there. So let's see, I've got a few more lines. Just gonna carefully get rid of those. And use my paper towel to get rid of those lines. And then keep adjusting my values. Squinting a lot. So go back and forth. Now, since my shadow shapes are actually darker at the top, so I'm going to carefully adjust those. And now I'm going the opposite direction against my initial marks that I made. So I went this way, now I'm crossing over those, cross hatching, but they're still very close together in mark making. So I'm not leaving big gaps between my marks. Now I'm going to take a look at this cast shadow. I'm going to have my marks go the length of the cast shadow. And you want to compare how dark is that cast shadow to the object. So really look at the value of your cast shadow here compared to the value of the pear right next to it. Make those adjustments. And look at the edges where the cast shadows get softer. Kind of soften up those edges. My cast shadow gets darker right in the center of the cast shadow where the pear is really blocking that light source. And the other pear is too, because they're leaning together. It gets darker as it is closer to the pear. And this one too, darker, closer to the pear, and it's further away from that light source, so it's getting very soft and fuzzy. And right at the edges, it gets a little darker here. And I'm going to adjust the lights in my ground plane so it slightly gets darker as we move across. So as that lightest light on this side facing my light source, and then it's going to carefully start getting a little darker as it moves across this way. You can use that eraser to break up the edge of your cast shadow. And as you get a little more charcoal on your eraser too, it'll help you to kind of control how much of that charcoal, that vine you're picking up. So close observation, making careful value transitions, using your charcoal pencils and your eraser as a drawing tool. This side up here is lighter as it gets closer to the background, and then not quite as light as it gets closer to the cast shadow. So keep all of these things in mind. And in my background, I will adjust that too. It is getting darker on this side. it is on this side. So carefully render all the way out to the edges and keep making adjustments as you go. Get as much detail as possible. And I'm not going to complete my second pear because we'll be sitting here too long. But I am going to do a little more on this one here. Really start to look at some of those subtleties. Smaller shifts in the planes. Don't want that line too heavy. Alright, just want to get this little negative shape nice and clean here. Alright, I think this gives you a good enough idea. Careful adjusting of your lights and your shadows. Really want to see you creating that pear portrait. So about 2 hours, 2 pears.